Hello and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. A lot of things going on right now, as usual, but I want to talk to you about prayer beads, give you some background information on them, how they relate to Kemeticism, and how I like to use them. There's a growing interest in the pagan community on using prayer beads, and I just recently picked up a couple of books on the subject. The first one that I picked up, yes, and you hear that, that's all the beads I've got to show you too. The first book is Pagan Prayer Beads, Magic and Meditation with Pagan Rosaries by John Michael Greer and Claire Vaughan. And there we go, you can see it. It's not very expensive, you can get it on Amazon. And this book focuses on telling you how to make prayer beads and gives you some ideas for prayer beads, or they use the word rosary. And I'll get to that in a minute. Different rosaries for different deities and for different purposes. They come from kind of a Druid or eclectic Wiccan tradition. The other book is The Magical Use of Prayer Beads, Secret Meditations and Rituals for Your Qabalistic, Hermetic, Wiccan, or Druid Practice by Jean-Louis de Biasi. There we go, you should be able to see the cover. The author of this book is a ceremonial magician. He has trained in Hermetic tradition, in Freemasons, in a particular Druid tradition, in a Wiccan tradition. Obviously very well read, very well studied, and he has a lot of different ceremonial uses in here. He takes you through particular types of prayer beads used by different, or that can be used in specific traditions. And there's a ritual in here that invokes some Egyptian deities from a Hermetic standpoint. Really interesting reading, and I recommend it too. It's newer, costs a little bit more, but especially if you're interested in ceremonial magic, I would say get this and go to his website, which I think it's listed in here. I'll throw the link up, for you. As I mentioned with the first book, they use the word rosary because that's the word that most of us Western pagans tend to think of in prayer beads. Most of us, if we encounter them first, it's going to be as a Catholic rosary. And I do have an example of one. This one is an heirloom of my husband's. It had belonged to someone in his family. And so you can see it has, of course, you have a set of 10 beads that represent, 10 Hail Marys, also known as a decade of the rosary. There's something representing the Virgin Mary, and then, of course, your crucifix down at the bottom. Each bead represents a specific prayer. Quickly going back to ancient Egypt, we don't really have any evidence directly of them using prayer beads in a manner like this. We do know that they had heavy strands of beads that had a counterpoise in the back. It was called a menad, and it would kind of rattle when you shake it, so it's kind of somewhere in a gray area between a ritual object and an instrument. And, of course, they would be carried in processions along with sistrums. So, as far as something representing individual prayers or things of the sort, there was no formal practice that we know of, but it would be hard to imagine that in the course of 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, no one ever handled beads while they were praying. Probably somebody did. Rosary, of course, comes from Latin. The Romans themselves got this from India because they had managed to reach the extreme reaches of the Roman Empire, went into India, and they saw Hindus there using, and I have an example, if I can disentangle it, japa mala. And this is a Hindu mala that I purchased recently. It's made of red sandalwood. The Romans, like any good tourists, heard japa mala and misinterpreted it. They heard jap, which means rose. And so, I guess, how it went from the Hindi tongue to Latin, and then jap became rosarium, which is where we got rosary from. Leave it to the tourists. Later on, Muslims also started using prayer beads, and who knows, they might have got the influence from the Hindus, who knows. that's lost to the sands of time, but each one of these beads, and there are 99, represents the name of Allah. And I got this set from a Middle Eastern grocery store, and you can see there's a lot of similarity here, but the philosophy behind each one is obviously very different. Some have claimed that it was actually the Muslim prayer beads that influenced the early Christians. Was it, the Hindus? Was it the Muslims? Was it the chicken or the egg? Who knows? But in the cross-fertilization of different cultures, Christians were probably the last ones to pick up the use of prayer beads in, their ritual practice. So don't consider beads as being tied to a specific tradition. They're used, by various ones. One of the things that influenced me actually was, here we are, grab another set, Buddhist prayer beads. And this is actually not representative of all Buddhist prayer beads. Some of them look a little more like the Hindu mala, in that they have 108 beads, and each one of those represents, instead of a name of deity, it represents one of the earthly desires. Or, in the Nichiren sect, we don't really count these beads. I don't know how many of them there are. I haven't bothered to count in a while. These two large ones represent Shakyamuni and Tahoe Buddha. And there's 2 on one side here, 3 tassels on the other. The way you would hold it is you would loop it over like this. If you're not counting prayers, what are you doing with prayer beads? Well, sometimes it's just handling them. A lot of the older Japanese ladies that I practiced with as a Buddhist, they would chant and they would rub their beads together, and so you would hear, a chorus of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo and, the beads going at the same time. Of course, what's funny is I was told in a different school of Nichiren Buddhism that when someone does this, that means it's time for everyone to stop. So, the sound can mean different things. In a way, it kind of goes back to the menat, that the Egyptians had, and using, beads for their sound quality. When I went from Buddhism to Egyptian practice, I guess that habit of wanting to have something in my hands, as I was praying, it stuck with me. And so I made a set of Kemetic beads, which obviously, let me set some of these down, we're going to get really confused. This was my Buddhist set, and so then I made this Kemetic set, and you can see the similarities. Except that I started to add different colors and things to represent specific things. You have this turquoise colored bead, which represents Noon, the primeval ocean. Oh, okay. That is thunder. Each one of the 8 beads here represents the 8 primeval gods, the Ogdoad. And the 4 sets here represent the 4 virtues, and then this is doubled, so you have the 8 ma'ats. And in a minute I'll read to you how I would use those in a prayer. Hail and praise unto you, O Ra, who came from Noon at the first time, for such is your uniqueness. Hail and praise unto you, O Ra, who placed Hu at your left side, for such are the words you commanded. Hail and praise unto you, O Ra, who placed Sia at your right side, for such is your great wisdom. Hail and praise unto you, O Ra, whose Hika goes before you, for such is your ability. Hail and praise unto you, O Ra, who rules with Ma'at upon your brow, for such is your righteousness. May I always act with gentility and compassion, for such is the first Ma'at. May I always offer charity and hospitality, for such is the second Ma'at. May I always respect consent and fidelity, for such is the third Ma'at. May I always avoid violence and promote wellness, for such is the fourth Ma'at. May I always speak words of truth, for such is the fifth Ma'at. May I always promote the public good, for such is the sixth Ma'at. May I always act humbly and with temperance, for such is the seventh Ma'at. May I always honor my gods and respect others, for such is the eighth Ma'at. May I uphold Ma'at like Jehuti, that I may witness Ra's perfection every day. Inun Ma'ah. That's not the only way that you can come up with Kemetic prayer beads, because there are some folks already who've come up with Kemetic rosaries. I have an example that I made because you can't, it's kind of like Pringles, you can't stop with just one. And so I started making them, and I have them on my Etsy store now. And here's an example of a Kemetic rosary. You have 42 beads instead of individual decades. And a very nice pendant down here. But there's some others that I make that are sets making a cameo. There's some other sets that are more like the mala. Something I have to clarify real quick. When we're talking about different traditions and different ways of using prayer beads, one difference that I noticed is that some sects will make them wearable and others will not. The Hindu mala that I've seen, large examples, and even this one, is made that you can put it on. And when you think of a guru wearing beads, sitting on a mountain top, he's wearing, a Hindu mala. However, no one in the Buddhist school that I was part of ever wore these. They were meant to be looped in your hand and or put on your altar table when you weren't using them, but they were not jewelry. So when I make my prayer beads, some of them are a little small to be worn. If you have a small head, you can kind of fit this over. That's great. I can't fit this one on mine, but it's not meant to be. It's meant to be just held and looped in the hand. So not all of them are meant to be worn. Some of them are just meant to be held in the hands, and it depends on tradition and also personal preference. So that being said, if you learn about all this and you're like, that's great, but beads just aren't my thing, hey, that's cool. But this means that if you get to go to a pagan gathering or something like that, you see someone who's wearing beads, they're just exploring, a pagan interpretation. If you're interested in beading, you could try doing this sort of thing. What's interesting is one other use that's not necessarily ceremonial for prayer beads, and the authors of this book talk about this because they had a Japanese grandmother, and they made a memorial set of beads, picking some beads that, reminded them of her as a way to, keep her in mind. And I ended up doing the same thing myself. And this set here, actually there's a story behind this set, because this is someone who is like an adopted grandfather to me. We weren't related by blood, but we were meant to meet each other, I think. Well, he had a stroke last year, and so I said, well, let me try and make some therapy beads, and that's something else that you could try. And you'll notice you have a really large bead, then small ones, and kind of small, different sizes, so that if you're trying to, regain dexterity, you've got something that you can sit there and play with. Well, I made a set that was very, very similar to this. The only difference is it had one less of the large beads. It was a little bit smaller loop, and I sent them to him. Well, they disappeared. I guess they were so pretty, one of the therapists there said, oh, I'll take that. So I don't know where his went. But I made a set just like it, except a little bit bigger, and this set is mine. And it's funny, the day I found out he had passed away, I happened to have this set in my hand, and was just holding them and thinking about him. And then later I found out that he was gone. So, I guess maybe somewhere he got the message, that these were for him. So that's something else that you can do with beads as well. And go on Etsy, because there's not just me, but also other folks that are making beads out there, and there's all sorts of cool stuff that you can find. If you want to know about some of the other things that I've been working on, go to my sister channel, Golden Age Video. Also, you'll notice in the end credits that it says support this channel. What that means is I've got it set up so that you can actually contribute funds, and that's something that we can put towards other videos. With that in mind, for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon wishing you Senebti.